What up, everyone? DJ Nubis here with you with the Metal Time Radio podcast. Doing a little video for you about the top must-have thrash albums for any Metalheads collection. And I'm going to go over a few things first just to let you know what this list is about, because when you peruse the web and see different articles about best thrash albums ever, it's always going to be different, and it's always subjective depending on the person, both with the bands involved and also how they perceive the nostalgia of either old records or even new records. So I'm going to let you know, first and foremost, I could have stayed with like classic thrash records, which I do have some in here. However, I've decided that my list is going to also involve some modern thrash bands and albums from the modern day. So we're talking like the last 20, 25 years. I'll have some records in there that are included in this list because I feel like they deserve to be mentioned. Also, my list, you could make an argument easily that some of the bands I have maybe more than one great album. So when I go through them, obviously I pick the albums that mean the most to me and I feel are strong enough to be in this list, as well as in any list in general. But like, people debate about what they feel is better than the other one. But this is my list, so I'm not trying to say any other records by these bands are bad or don't deserve any recognition at all. These are just my favorites to what I feel like if I'm going to recommend somebody who's trying to look into thrash metal, this is what you would look at and this is what you would get. The rankings I have for this aren't necessarily the order that they would come in. Like, obviously, I'll talk about some as because I'm very high on them, but as far as 25 through 1, it doesn't necessarily mean that's the order that they're in. Those are my top 25 albums that I want to talk about. Also, you have some bands that will also it won't be just traditional thrash, so they'll cross over a little bit into death thrash, even a little bit of hardcore sometimes. So don't be shocked when you see stuff like that. This isn't like a pure thrash type thing. So I'm giving you everything that thrash metal in general can throw at you. I'm not really wavering too far off in genres, but you'll see a little differences in some of the bands in there. Now, quickly before we get started, on Tubi right now, if you have this app on Roku or whatever, if you ever watch Tubi, there's a couple of good docs on there, both 1 and 2 of Bay Area Godfathers, and they really are very in depth with the bands of the Bay Area, thrash bands of that time period in the 80s and early 90s. Great interviews. They talk, obviously about Metallica, Slayer, Heathen, Laz Rocket, which a little bit of a gripe with it is that Laz Rocket does have some times that they discuss the band a little bit. And of course, Michael Coons, the singer, is being interviewed throughout these docs. But when it came time for them to actually focus on the band, they kind of glossed over it a little bit, which was disappointing because I felt like they could have talked a little more about that band. Even though they say some good things about Laz Rocket, there wasn't enough for me to be sated, I guess would be the word I would use for that. But they're both very well done. It's not like 45 minutes per doc. It doesn't cheap out like that. It's at least an hour and a half per doc. So it's called the Bay Area Godfathers 1 and 2. Free on YouTube, on Tubi right now. So check it out if you want. Certainly worth your time if you're looking into a little bit of a history lesson there with some of the behind the scenes. They talk about Dave Mustaine and Metallica a lot and stuff like that. And even Lars is in there being interviewed. So kind of fun to go back and revisit that. All right. Well, we're scrolling down here. I'm going to start with number 25 on my list. And really, this is probably one of the fewer bands that were already starting to dabble with technicality and progressiveness, I guess you would say. That would be Heathen with Victims of Deception. And This band at the time consisted of duo great guitarists and Lee Altus and Doug Pierce. You actually see Doug Pierce being interviewed in that doc I was talking about. This record is amazing, front to back, and even though they'd had an album prior to that, their debut, which had the great cover of Sweet's "Set Me Free," "Victims of Deception" to me was just a strong, strong effort, and I fell in love with it. Heathen's Song, which is like a ballad-esque type thing. It's almost like 8 minutes long, but it's so amazing. Like the guitar work is fabulous on that record. They kind of lulled. They stopped after a while. I don't know if they just broke up for a period of time, but in 2010 they released The Evolution of Chaos, which I wasn't really feeling that record. I know some people really like it, but 2020's Empire of the Blind was fantastic. I thought that was a much stronger record. And I really like that one a lot. So, but I think as far as like a must-have for any thrash fan, "Victims of Deception" from 1991, I believe it was. That's the record you need to have. Period. At number 24, we have Violence, Eternal Nightmare, and this is kind of an interesting thing about this particular band. The original lineup included Sean Killian and also Rob Flynn of Machine Head. Now, of course, the current lineup they have, because I guess they've kind of gotten back together. I know they're going to be playing MDF this coming May in Maryland. So I'm really excited to see them because I'd never seen them before. But they have some familiar faces. Former Overkill axeman Bobby Gustafson is in their lineup now, as well as former Fear Factory bassist Christian Old Wolbers. So that's really kind of cool. I first got introduced to Violence through their sophomore record, "Oppressing the Masses," and "Officer Nice" was always a cool song for me because it's about anti-police brutality and shit like that. And but when I finally went back to listen to Eternal Nightmare because I'd heard so much about it, I'm like, this is the shit. This is great quality riffs, great thrash, and it will probably end up on tons of top 25 thrash album lists. Like you see it constantly being mentioned. So number 23, Overkill, Years of Decay. And they've been around like fucking forever. We're talking like 1983 when they were actually kind of more of a heavy metal band at that point. It wasn't too long till like 1985 or so that they started progressing into the thrash thing over in New York. And first time I ever seen or heard Overkill was probably in '88 with the video "Hello from the Gutter" off Under the Influence. That was their third release at that point. And I just fell in love with them at that point. I'd like really become a big fan of the band. I've seen them a couple times in concert. They light it up like no else. Throughout the years, they've stayed consistent. We've talked about with Neko on our podcast and everything that thrash metal, some bands like Metallica or Megadeth or Slayer, they kind of altered their sound, whether they're trying to fit in with what's going on around them or they're trying to explore themselves, into different areas. Overkill, they don't play that. They bring you to thrash. People say that's boring, but to me, that's a trademark of a band who stays true to who they are. And even today, they just put out another album out a couple of years ago called "The Wings of War," so they're still going. They have tons of records and some quality records out there. It's thrash, but like, cool thing about Years of Decay for me was, I'm not gonna say it was a progressive record, but it was definitely when Overkill was exploring a little more. I know they did some exploring on Horoscope a little bit, but Years of Decay, they really played around with like songs like "Playing with Spiders" or "Who Tends to Fire," the title track "Years of Decay." These are all songs that like were a little bit longer than your usual like 3 to 4 minute thrash song. So they had already started beginning to kind of play around with the exploring and being a little more progressive or technical with their sound. Now they eventually kind of just went back to straightforward stuff, 3 and 4 minute songs, but I like the fact that Overkill wasn't afraid to explore that without going over the deep end. They didn't get super wankery with it. They didn't like totally change their sound or anything like that. They just, depending on the mood of the album or the songs, they kind of just played around and say, "Oh yeah, this is pretty cool," So But Years of Decay kind of showcases a lot of that. So I highly, highly recommend that record for you. Let's see. Number 22, and this is going to be controversial with people, really, because, again, I'm going to restate this, that this is my pick and not necessarily dissing any other record from this band or albums from this band. This album meant a lot to me at the time, even though I'd already heard them prior with Among the Living. But 1988's State of Euphoria from Anthrax, like, this to me is like a great record from start to finish. And most people obviously will keep choosing like Among the Living or even some of their more heavy metal releases like Fistful of Metal, stuff like that, where it's more traditional heavy metal. And then, of course, the cool thing about Anthrax is even when Joey Belladonna finally left or was kicked out, I can't remember how it went down, but he was replaced by former Armored Saint vocalist John Bush. And when they released Sound of the White Noise, they didn't really miss a beat. Like, it was different in terms of vocal arrangements and presentation, but the albums were still thrash and very strong. But State of Euphoria was always the one that I really go back to the most. And some people thought it was a little bit too commercial or mainstream for Anthrax, but I really kind of thought it was a strong record. It wasn't too mainstream for me to where I think it like posing off or anything. I really enjoyed that record a lot. Yeah, so I can't really say much more about that than that, but people obviously will always choose like Among the Living as like their go-to in terms of these lists are concerned. But that's State of Euphoria is my pick on that record. 21. And this is a band that's sort of new to me, and I can't give you a whole lot of information because I don't know a lot about them personally. I've only gotten into them maybe since 2017, which is, I think, when they actually got their first debut out, and that's Germany's Vulture. And the record I chose is 2021's Dealing Death, which came out this past year. I think it's their most complete to date, but I can honestly tell you their first two releases are just as pretty good. They're very up there as well. So, like, even though Metal Archives, they have their reviews and the percentages, and it's kind of like Rotten Tomatoes, so like some people either love it or hate it, but I think they're a solid band, and they also dabble with speed and traditional heavy metal in the thrash. So you're getting a little bit of everything thrown at you with this band, but it's awesome. I really like it a lot, and it's unique to itself. Kind of reminds me of older school thrash with the sound arrangements and the presentation. So definitely check them out. Dealing Death was last year's release, which is my pick on this one. Number 20. It would have been so easy to go with Rust in Peace from Megadeth, but I had to go with the album that I always go back to the most. And I know some people either pick Rust in Peace or Peace Cells or even Killing Is My Business, which is their first record. But so far, so good, so what? This is the album that got me into them. And I don't know. I love everything about this record. And I know that, like, when I first heard it, it was actually the cover of the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK, which is a great cover. But the thing that I love about this record is that its production is gritty and dirty. And you can sit there and argue that the technicality on Rust in Peace is far superior, which I get. And even Countdown to Extinction was a very solid record on its own, even though they had started their movement towards a little bit more ear-friendly, I guess, at that point. But so far, so good, so what to me. It just has a strong set of songs. And, some people write it off, because, again, throughout Megadeth's career, Mustaine has always had lineup changes. It wasn't really until Friedman and Nick Menza showed up that they kind of stayed, together for a little while. I mean, they eventually both were gone too, but at least at that point there was some consistency, because up until then, Megadeth kept throwing out their guitarists left and right. The only mainstay was really David Ellefson, the bassist. So, I don't know. This record for me, though, a lot of great tracks on it. Has to be in someone's collection. I remember a funny story for me is getting the remaster of this record, thinking, oh, Well, that'd be kind of cool if they just pumped it up a bit for when you played a CD in your car or whatever. But what I learned was they also redid the vocals. Like Mustang, I don't know what the fuck he was thinking here, but remastered the record, but then redid the vocals on the record, replayed everything, and it just didn't have the same feel at all. And I remember when I first bought the remaster, before I even listened to it, I gave Neko my older copy of the album, and after listening to the remaster, I ended up going back and taking my old one back. I gave her a new one, which she didn't like, but yeah, it was a mistake. Like, you know, when I think of remasters or trying to pump up the volume a little bit on some of these older records, to me, it's just you fix the sound to match today's standards, and I know it's hard. Sometimes you can does a really good job with it, sometimes you can't. But when you go and you try to rewrite the music or replay it or even re-sing it, it just doesn't come across the same way. And that's what happened here with this when they tried to redo that. So didn't like that. Make sure if you buy it, you get the original pressings of that fucking record. Do not settle for anything else. 19, Dark Angel. Gotta love this record. Darkness Descends, their sophomore release. Obviously, this band features the god on drums, Gene Hoglan. I don't know. I didn't even really revisit this record. I didn't even discover this record till 10 or 15 years ago. I knew who the band was because I had bought Leave Scars and Time Does Not Heal. Those were like the first two Dark Angel records I have, and they're fine in their own right. But at that point, Dark Angel had already started kind of doing not so much progression, but they were really exploring their riffage. And I remember one of the big things said about Time Does Not Heal was there's like 646 different riffs on this record. Like that was something they were touting at the time that like no other band was doing, I guess, trying to change up the arrangements and stuff. And it was fine, but when I listen to Darkness Descends, like it's just more straightforward, and it's also got a very gritty and dirty type vibe about it because of the time that it was recorded. I think it was like 86, I want to say, maybe a little later. But I was like Merciless Death and Perish in Flames are like my favorites of that. It encapsulates what great thrash is for me. And yeah, I really love this record so much, like more like, and it's fun because nowadays people are like, why did you know about try this record way back when? Well, you know, I was trying to get to everything I could back then, and you didn't have really access to music like we do today. I can certainly tell you back then in the 80s and 90s, like I relied strictly on guessing when I go into CD stores. Like I go through and I'm browsing and I'm like looking around like, oh, this looks interesting, and but then you got this, and sometimes you'll buy something that looks cool on the cover, but the music isn't very good to match it. Or you see a cover that looks like shit, and you're like, I don't want to do that. But then you come back years later and you find out, oh, this music is amazing. They just didn't put very much thought into the artwork. So, yeah, you know, this record is probably my favorite of the group. I thought that the band was going to do another record at some point, because I remember running into Gene Hoglan when he was playing with Strapped Young Lad, and I'd asked him, like, you know, I'd heard you guys were going to get back together and do something. And he's like, yeah, we're trying to work it, but this was like almost 15 years ago. We did see them at MDF a few years back as a band playing live, and they were playing some older material and whatnot, but I don't think they put a new record out since then. So if they have, you can correct me, but I don't think they have. All right, 18. And I'd already been a fan of the singer of this band through the band of Volst out of Spain, death metal band. And we saw them a few years ago, Volst playing, and they were actually playing one of the earlier times of the day, which means it wasn't like a lot of people gathered at that point, because it takes people longer to get in as the day goes on. So I kind of felt that was a shame, because Volst like really lit it up, and Dave Rotten a great vocalist. Like I was seeing him do things like the whole twirling and singing thing. Like I'm like, how's he doing that and not fucking up the lyrics or the way he's singing it? And I met him later in the day. Very cool guy. Took a photo with me. So when I found out that he was singing for this thrash act, I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. I didn't even think he was in another project. So 2020's Fist to Face from Holy Side, which features Dave on the vocals, is an amazing record. And it's an exceptional piece of work and certainly worthy of any modern thrash fan that, you know, if you're into thrash metal stuff, this is something you should have as well. The first record wasn't bad either, but Fist to Face is like amazing. So that's something you need to check out. Get it, own it, love it. Number 17. Again, I mean, this one does get mentioned on lists sometimes, not as much as Doomsday is a Deceiver. But Flotsam and Jetsams, No Place for Disgrace. I can't crow enough about this record. Features an awesome Elton John cover of Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, but it has so many great tracks, and the vocal work is amazing in there. And also, the band, even though Jason Newsted didn't play on this record, he played on Doomsday before going to Metallica. So that's a little bit of history there with that, because Flotsam was Newsted's original band. But the songwriting didn't fall at all after Newsted left. No Place to me is actually a stronger effort than Doomsday, but you know, it just depends on who you are. But I really love that record a lot. So that's going to make my top 25 list easily. 16, again, this isn't about like ranking them, like this is no particular order. However, people have heard me talk about this particular record a lot. I know it varies from fan to fan, which one is their favorite of the catalog. But this, Master of Puppets, easily my favorite Metallica record ever. For so many different reasons. Certainly the first one I heard from the band, I already knew who Metallica was because I had friends who were into them before I was, and you know, I didn't really pay much attention to them initially, but when I was working at a pizza parlor where we were tearing it down one summer, and this guy, a couple of guys who were older than us, me and my friend, we were helping out, and of course I'm jamming like Rat, you know, so I'm listening to a Rat record and he's listening to Master Puppet, and he's like, well, have you ever heard Metallica? I'm like, well, I've heard of the band, I just haven't heard the music. He's like, okay, here you go. Now I said, do you want to listen to the Rat? He's like, no thanks. So I'm like listening throughout the day, and I'm like, dude, can I borrow this? I want to copy this to tape. And he's like, go for it. And of course, ironically, we went to his pad, which was down the street, for lunch, and he also was into like other stuff like Celtic Frost, which he was playing for us, and I was really into that. I was like, well, that's cool too. I've never heard them. So I kind of discovered other stuff through him, but that was the moment where I fell in love with Metallica in terms of that record. And over time, many people won't look at Master of Puppets as like a progressive record, really, because it's not wanky or wankery or anything like that, but there is a sense of progression in it when you compare it to Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning. And even after that record, and when we, you know, after the passing of Cliff Burton tragically in a bus accident, we learned that Cliff really was a big influence on Metallica early in their careers. And that album in particular, I think Cliff had his biggest impact. And it pains me in a lot of ways that Cliff is gone, because I don't know where the band would have ended up. Like, we know And Justice for All was okay, you know, it did well, and then of course the Blackout, and we know the history of Metallica at this point, but I have to wonder if Cliff survived, like whether he would have remained with the band or if the band would have continued to stay in their thrash roots and kind of kept going in a more exploratory direction or not, without going over the deep end into the rock stuff. I never really saw Cliff kind of being that kind of guy. I don't think the mainstream really appealed to him that much like that. Could be wrong. I didn't know him personally, but just judging by his playing and how forward thinking he was, I don't think that would have happened. What else am I saying? This, yeah. So that's basically it on that one. I just do feel like that Master of Puppets is their strongest release. Uh, People will sometimes choose Kill 'Em All or Ride the Lightning as their pinnacle. I have no problem with either one of those records. I really like those records a lot. I kind of waned off of Injustice for All, and even though I liked a couple of tracks on Black Album, I really don't even listen to those records anymore. It's usually the first three that I maintain and stay with, because it's more me, more who I am. All right, let's get into number 15, and this one, I have to admit, I'm a very late bloomer to this particular band. I did own their last record, which was called Grin, and I enjoyed tracks like Serpent Moves off of that record. I'd already known their history in terms of recognition and how people saw them like it's a really great band, but I never listened to any of their earlier records, and shame on me for that, but at least not until recently. So we're talking again last 10 or so years. I could literally put any of their first four records in this list, but the one I chose because I love it the most is Coroner's No More Color. And yeah, this band is amazing. Like, the fact that I didn't catch it back then is shameful on me. Wish I had taken the time more to research and go back and revisit that stuff then. But, it's never too late. This is why I kind of like doing this list, because now I get a chance to have more involved with my picks. Like, instead of sticking with like regular big names, or sticking with the last 15 years, I can sit there and say, well, we got some of the old school, we got some of the new school, we got some of the middle school, and hopefully people can go through those or go through this list and check them out, because you can find tracks from any of these records on YouTube and just listen to it. In Spotify now, everyone does a different way when they listen to music. So again, highly recommend that record, or any of the first four, because they're all very good, highly recommended. So 14 is Prong's Beg to Differ, and discovered this band through MTV, actually, when if you remember the early Headbanger Ball, their anthem at the beginning when they did intro is actually a song Lost and Found from that record on Prong. And like, when I discovered it, I was like, oh wow, that's awesome. This band has kind of dabbled with alternative rock over the years, mainly in the 90s. Like, Cleansing very much went into that half metal, half alternative rock, which was still a pretty solid record. Like, some people will kind of shy away from that record because it is a bit different, but some of the more rockish songs on that record are very well written. Like, Tommy Victor and company did a pretty good job on that, despite changing the sound a little bit there. I mean, obviously, Snap Your Finger, Snap Your Neck was the biggest single off of that record, which is still very much metal, but a lot of that record is also a lot of more rockish. I still enjoy the shit out of it, though. But Prove You Wrong from 91, I believe, and then, of course, Beg to Differ, this record, which was before that, are much stronger to me and my favorites of the bunch. Even though Prong is still around, they still put out some pretty decent material. Beg to Differ and Prove You Wrong are probably their tops for me, but Beg to Differ was just so much more raw than Prove You Wrong, and the way the songs are written it just, I don't know. Like, they did have a debut called Force Fed, and I know that's highly recommended by people, but I don't know. Beg to Differ is my jam. This is the one that I go back to the most, outside of Prove You Wrong. And so it makes my list here at number 14. Again, doesn't mean it's higher or lower than any other ones, but it definitely deserves to be on the list, in my opinion. Number 13 is actually a newer modern thrash band. In fact, they only have one record to date from 2019, and that's Concrete Jungle by Fusion Bomb. And this album is really, really fucking good, man. I'm telling you. No one really talks about it or brings it up, but quality thrash there. They got that. They've really captured that traditional thrash sound, and it's a strong, strong record. It was one of my favorites of 2019, and I can't talk about it enough. It's a great record that belongs in any list, any collection. So again, this is just me sharing you my opinions on what I think you would like as a thrash fan. And if you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's very, very good. All right. Number 12. I walked into a used record store back in the late 80s, early 90s. And this is when I was really kind of snatching up cassettes and CDs all the time. Just trying out different bands. And, sometimes hit or miss. But I saw the two records that this band had put out. Because they hadn't put anything out since then over the years, but I'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute. But I picked up both these records and fell in love with both of them. They were in heavy rotation for a long time. I did hear their anthem, Beer Bong, from a friend of mine who owned the first record, which is the one that made my list, and that's Atrophy's Socialize Hate. When we talk thrash, this band does not really get talked about enough, and they should. I love this band like a lot. I saw them with Neko a few years ago when they played MDF. They got back together to play MDF as like a special thing, and met the guys, took pictures with them. They were all very humble, very cool. They played almost everything except for Beer Bong. They tried to get through every song on both those records. They almost made it. Couldn't get to Beer Bong, which was unfortunate, but I was talking to the guys, got pictures, shirts. And when I was talking to them, they were saying they were going to work on a new record. Now, this was a few years ago. And I see them occasionally on Facebook still talking about maybe putting a record out. So I don't know how far along they are with this. And then I just discovered today before doing this show that original vocalist Brian Zimmerman's not a part of the band anymore. I don't know what's behind that. Maybe it's just personal life stuff. So they ended up getting a guy named Mike Nigel. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but I'm not familiar with him, but he's listed on Metal Archives as their new singer. So it's going to be interesting. I'm sure that he can sing the music. Like, you can usually find a singer to sing old material with no problems, but one of the things about Brian was unique is his voice, and I'm just wondering how that's going to translate with a new singer. But I'm always game to give it a try, and I would love to see some new Atrophy music out, because as a band they're very talented, and those first two records, Socialize Hate and Violent by Nature, man, gotta have them. And I could alternate either one of those records into this list and wouldn't feel bad about it. So definitely Socialize Hate made my list, and needs to be had. Number 11. So another band like Corner. I knew about them by name because people talk about them, and over the years I've seen them on the best of list and greatest albums of list, and it was always kind of weird to me because when looking them up, at that point they'd only had one record to their name, like they either split up or something or didn't put out anything out until 2015's Destruction System. But back in '88, Morbid Saint put out Spectrum of Death, and when I fucking heard this, dude, because I wanted to know what the hype was all about and see what the stink was about, and when I heard it, dude, I immediately ordered. When I saw a friend of mine overseas who sells me cassettes here and there that I buy, he had this on cassette, and I was like, I gotta have that, gotta have it, dude. Gotta have it. It's just such a great record, and yeah, I don't want to get too involved with it because I'd be saying the same thing about everything anyway. So, but these are just highly recommended albums from me to you, whoever's viewing this. So, when you see this album show up on best love list, it's well deserved. It belongs there heavily. Number 10, and this is interesting because, again, when we talk about bands with long-standing histories and various like great albums from said bands where they have more than one, uh, I recently went back and listened to like the first 3 or 4 records from this band because they've never been one of my overall favorite bands when it comes to the thrash genre, and that's I'm not saying I don't enjoy them at all. Um, but I had to go back and just revisit and just say to myself, like, maybe I'm missing something that I hadn't quite caught before. And even though I knew one particular record had a song that I really liked, I said, oh, let me go back and revisit this one. And I can say right now, though, my favorite song from this band actually shows up on their third album, Fabulous Disaster, from Exodus. However, my favorite record from this band, and they're still around, is Pleasures of the Flesh. And I'm going to get more controversial with people because I know Bonded by Blood, which is the first record that Exodus put out, also featured the original vocalist, Paul Baloff, or Bailiff, I guess you would say pronounce it. But I was never a big fan of his vocals, really not. And I know it's massive sacrilege to people. They're going to really disagree with me on that. But I'm a big Steve Souza fan. I really think his voice fits well with Exodus. And I know he took a lot of shit when he first joined the band. In fact, you'll kind of see some of the interviews that Steve does in those docs I was talking about where, even though they all love Paul a lot, because Paul's a crazy man and, he was just a wild man. But Steve talks a little bit about, or at least some of the other people talk about how Steve was kind of unfairly treated when Paul was out of the band at that point. I think he was kicked out, actually. But, it's not me trying to diss Paul at all in any way. But I prefer Steve's vocals. And when it comes to a total package of an album, Pleasures of the Flesh definitely is something that I like more than anything else that Exodus has put out, as in totality, I should say. They have a lot of great material later in their career, obviously. Their last record was pretty good. The new one they put out. So, it's not, there's no like slight on the band for me. I just know how controversial it'd probably be for me to say that I like Steve over Paul, but, personal taste really is what it comes down to. Let's see, number 9. Same issue here, but, it's all personal preference. When it comes to best of lists, it's 9 times out of 10, it's going to be Rain and Blood that will show up on lists. For this guy, me, it's going to be Seasons and Abyss by Slayer. I feel like it's the most complete record they have, as well as the strongest in presentation and production. Like, I know, and I'm back and forth with production. I know that's kind of hypocritical of me at times, but when it comes to Slayer, I feel like when they're at their cleanest, I guess, in terms of sound, I think that's when they sound their best. Like when you go, at least in the modern age, with like even back to '90, when you hear them live, it sounds so strong and pumped up, like when they play live. And I don't know if when they were playing clubs, if it sounded much like it did on the earlier records, like with the little more raw production, but Seasons was like really a crisp, clear sound for them at that point. Even on South of Heaven, like I didn't feel like that they really pumped up the volume much with that. It was still very much more guitar driven rather than any kind of you couldn't really hear the bass much in that record at all for me. Whereas Seasons, everything seemed more collective in presentation, and I can say this about this band, Slayer, that having seen them 7 times since 1990, starting with the Clash of the Titans tour, they have never disappointed live. And even without Hanneman, when I saw them 2 or 3 years ago, they still shred live, dude. Like, they are an amazing live band, without a doubt. All right, number 8. And this one, I had a hard time picking an album from this one, to be honest. Like, I could have gone with the first record I heard from with Frolic Through the Park, or even Ultraviolence. But when it comes to Death Angel, like, I found that the later release of The Evil Divide was actually their best in terms of songwriting and presentation and just the quality of riffs for me. It just seems more fluent in how they mesh together. And even though after 2004, when they actually reformed and released Art of Dying, which I hated, I know some people like that record. I just really hate that record. I was like really worried. I was like, you guys come back and do that. It's not very good. However, since then, the other 4 records, the Dream Calls for Blood, Humanicide from 2019, Relentless, Retribution, and of course Evil Divide. These are all very strong records, but Evil Divide to me is like their strongest to date. And if I had to just recommend one record for you, it would be this one. If you were just going to go and off my list, like if you were going to buy 25 records, I would start here with these. I would certainly tell you to go and get the first 3 records from Death Angel easily. No problem there either. But if we're talking about more modern thrash and whether or not some of these bands can keep up with the modern times, Death Angel easily can. They've, ever since Relentless, they've found their groove again, and they've blown it out of the park since then. So I'm glad that they refound their groove there with that. Let me see. Number 7. Only 2 records this band has, and unfortunately, with the passing of singer Riley Gale in 2020, I'm not sure what's going to happen with this band. Riley was such a huge part of their live shows. I have seen them live, and they're very good. Both records they have, Manifest Decimation and Nightmare Logic, are amazing records. You could probably again also either one of these albums as on this list, and I'd be fine with it. But I chose Manifest Decimation, their debut, as the one I would pick to go after first. Just a very strong record, great thrash, and they are very old school with their thrash sound, and it's just amazing. And Riley was a huge loss, like so much so that you would actually find him. They were talking about his death on like Fox News. Like that's how much of, because he was he's a spokesman. He was an activist, and he spoke his mind. And so I think the thing about the Fox News guys, because they're conservatives, that I forget who the guy was that did the interview with Riley, but he said, I'm actually friends with Riley, even though we don't agree on politics. But he says Riley was so well spoken and thought out with what he was telling me on his side of things that he had to say something about the death of Riley and how much it meant, the loss to him. Just shows you that, even though with our differences politically, whatever, that we need to find common ground with each other, because in the end we're all humans and need to treat each other with civility and respect, even if we disagree on certain things. But Riley would be missed, but those 2 records that Power Trip put out, must-haves. Just start with Manifest and see what you think, and then go from there. Number 6, Forbidden's Twisted Into Form. Yeah, so when I first discovered this band, when I was a wee little teenager, went into the record store, saw the cassette for their debut. I think it was the EP. I don't think it was even full length, but It was called Forbidden Evil. And I remember at the time how funny it was for me because I'm going, is the band called Forbidden and the album's called Evil? Or is it Forbidden Evil? Because I could never tell by the way the tape was designed. And when I watched the doc recently with those Bay Area Thrash, they also bring up the fact that Forbidden was once Forbidden Evil. So that was their name, Forbidden Evil. So then when Twisted in the Form got released, they just dropped Evil and went with Forbidden, which is fine. Didn't hurt the music any. And I'll tell you this, the vocal work of Russ Anderson is amazing. It's some of the best stuff you'll ever hear in terms of like thrash metal. And then, of course, the band itself took a little bit of heat because some people thought they were a little too much more like power metal or heavy metal. And like, again, I don't know why anybody really complained about that aspect of it. But when you listen to Twisted and Informed, there's no doubt that it's thrash metal. None to me. You might be able to make some of those comparisons early with the Forbidden Evil release, but yeah, Twisted and Informed is a thrash record and belongs on any list, period. All right, where are we? I'm losing track here. Okay. Number 5. When I first heard a friend play this record for me, fell in love with it, but I had a hard time deciding if it was supposed to be death metal or thrash. And then, weirdly enough, in 2005, and this is kind of embarrassing for me, but it was 2005, I was talking with somebody on a forum about this record and this band at this time, and I'd always made the argument that they were death metal. Maybe it's just because of the album covers or whatever, but the guy that I was talking to, he's like, no, dude, it's like death thrash. And I'm like, I never really considered that. And it makes sense because the way these songs are arranged are different than death. But then the vocal work and the lyrical content and the images and all very much in a death vibe. So I'm like, well, that makes sense. And now that kind of like introduced me to what death thrash is and could be. And as time has passed on now, I would make the argument that maybe Possessed was the earliest version of death thrash, even though some people will consider Possessed to be the early version of death metal. I don't really see Possessed. When I've heard Possessed, and I do like them, but I don't consider Possessed a death metal band. I would consider them a death thrash band easily. But I think when it comes to a band that stood out the most at that time in the late 80s with the more recognition and notoriety is going to be Sepultura's Beneath the Remains. I always go back between this record and Arise as my favorites. Of course, over the years, since 95, the lineup changes, the sound changes. I'm not as big into Sepultura as I once was. During that late 80s, early 90s, I was a huge Sep fan. Like even with Chaos AD, which they started kind of dabbling with the changing of sound a little bit, but that record's still very strong too. But Arise and Beneath the Remains are still like my go-tos. I picked Beneath the Remains because that was my earliest love, and because it's also a little bit grittier and dirtier than Arise in the sense that the way it's produced and the way it's presented on record. A lot of great tracks on it. I can't crow enough about this. You will see this record show up on a lot of best of lists time and time again, which is well deserved. Yeah. So Beneath the Remains is my pick. Number 4, I would say this band first showed up around 2008, and I've talked about it a little bit with Ian from Retro Syria. If you saw some of our discussions about thrash metal there, that in the late 90s to mid 2000s, thrash metal had kind of got stagnant and dead. Like even though there was some thrash bands being out there, I don't think there was anything really of quality and note. Now maybe if I go back and revisit that era. Maybe I'll find some stuff that was just underground and no one really knew about them. But 2008 really around that time is when I saw the resurgence of thrash coming with bands like Havoc and Vector and some of the stuff. And Warbringer was another one at the time that stood out. I'd kind of first caught a glimpse of them live when they were opening up for Vader one year. And, you know, even though my favorite song from this band isn't on this record that I chose, they have a lot of quality material. And I think they're very much a big part of the reason why we have this resurgence in thrash metal today. But the album I chose is their last record they put out a couple years ago, is Weapons of Tomorrow. And from start to finish, amazing record. Again, they've already put out like 3 or 4 records before this, but now I feel like they're kind of like in their stride. Like they've got it all clicking on all cylinders. And it's just amazing to me when I think back, because I got worried about thrash. People were like, you still like thrash metal, in the early 2000s. I'm like, dude, it's dead. There's no one there. Even with the bands that were still around, the only band you could really rely on was really Overkill. Because most of them either disbanded, or you had Megadeth and Slayer kind of like dabbling in their exploratory thing with new metal and everything else they were doing at the time. Overkill is really the only consistent, band from that time and era that was still putting out thrash records that were noticeable. So it was kind of cool by the time Warbringer came around that, okay, now we got some guys who are revisiting the old school vibe and sound of thrash metal and kind of bring it back up to the forefront. They're paying homage. Even if you don't think it's quite original, they're still paying homage and doing it in their own way. And now we have like a influx of bands, thrash bands, quality thrash bands out there, even to the point where they're, dabbling from other genres. So you have like black thrash bands, death thrash, even like bands like, Oxygen Destroyer back here are a great, new breed of death thrash out there and whatnot with a little bit of black element. So there's some stuff out there, but it wasn't really until Warbringer kicked it in that things started to take off a little bit. And very appreciative of that band to get noticed. And they are great live. They are fun live, let me tell you. They can bring it. At number 3, if you followed our show, especially with our best of this year, 2021, you will know that this band was going to make this list. By far, my favorite release of 2021 is Enforced Killgrid. And I was blown away. I did not expect it. This was a band I knew nothing about when I first heard the record. And when I did, I was like floored. It immediately became a favorite of mine. Neko and I recently saw them live when they came to Baltimore with Exhumed and stuff like that. And dude, they know how to bring it. They have a lot of fucking energy in their live sets, and they're fun and they're very cool. Like, we bought some merch from them. They were very friendly, and I bought their first record, which I have yet to listen to. I need to go do that, but I'm so hooked in Killgrid that I haven't really paid much attention to anything else. But really good guys. This album is fun. Like, again, we're getting back to the fun aspect of thrash. It's heavy. These guys are in tune with each other when they play live. I don't know how hard it is. I've never been a musician in a band, but when you watch bands sometimes and like they're jamming up there, but they're not really in sync as far as like, the headbanging or whatever. Like, I don't even know how important that is. These guys, when they're doing their riffs and they're headbanging, they're all in tune with each other. Like, it's amazing. Like, they just click and get it. And it's a newer thrash, death thrash album record, but it's so strong. It's so incredibly well written, and we played some for you, so check it out on our podcast. I think we did both on regular episodes as well as our best of episode that we did not too long ago. So check it out as we get down to our last two. And yeah, so number two. And sometimes when we talk like about the big four of thrash, so you talking Metallica, Megadeth, Anthrax, and Slayer, right? And people oftentimes, metal fans, you know, we all get together on message boards and whatever, and we're talking about it, and we're like, well, if you could replace one band or two bands in the big four, what would you do? Well, this band gets brought up enough to be in the big four. And that's Testament. Yeah, Testament. That's right. I discovered this band for the very first time via MTV again. Because really, without the internet, that was one of your best ways to learn about anything, unless you were someone who did all that tape trading through the magazines and stuff, which I wasn't a part of in terms of me knowing about it or really investing. I didn't know enough about it to do or feel comfortable doing that with any of that. So I'm really impressed when people actually did that across seas with each other. We're like, yeah, you got to check out this band. I'm going to send it to you. And it's really just amazing how that all worked before pre-internet. But with MTV, you know, you were still able to see, despite all the over production of like hard rock and glam rock at the time, you know, they were still throwing in thrash and heavy metal, and sometimes you'd see Merciful Fate, stuff like that in there. But catching the cover of Nobody's Fault from Testament, the video itself was a lot of fun. Like, compared to some of the other thrash bands around that time, when you always seen all so far more serious in presentation, these guys looked like they were just having a blast. And Eric Peterson, of course, you know, he's got his little camera and he's filming everybody. And, you know, the whole idea was they were driving out to their show, and they thought initially they were playing the Summit in Houston, Texas, and it was actually not. It was like a smaller club they were playing. So if you haven't ever seen the video, it's funny. It's really hilarious, and it kind of hooked me in. And then when I saw the video for Trial by Fire, which is a little bit more of a straightforward thrash, a little bit more serious, I went and picked up the record immediately and fell in love with it. Like, it's such a great record, and it's another one of those things where people usually pick the Legacy, which is their debut, as the one they would put in the list of best of or must-haves. But New Order is definitely going to be the one that I want above all else, and still my favorite record to this day. Even though the band has kind of gone through lineup changes, and, you know, they kind of lost a little bit of where they wanted to be as a band at some point. Like, some of the records were okay. They even had James Murphy on Low, which was kind of cool, but I don't think I really felt the record as much as other people did. But the last few records, you know, since Formations and stuff like that, have been really solid outings from them, and they're getting back again, in my opinion, back into their groove like Death Angel is. Like, they're just finding what it was that worked with them as a band, and of course Skolnick is back there with them as well. So great record, highly recommended, need it, which leaves us to our number one. And really, I talked about this with the doc, how I felt like they kind of glossed over Law's Rocket, and I don't want to short sell the doc, because they do praise Laws a lot in there, and they do have Michael Coons in there, which is really cool to see him doing interviews. I was shocked, because most docs that I see on Thrash rarely even mention Law's Rocket at all. But if there's a thrash album that defined me in the 80s in terms of a record that I played nonstop for like 3 years upon its release, like, never took it out of rotation. In fact, I had to rebuy or repurchase the cassette, because I initially had the cassette here in Maryland with me, but I must have lost it or left it in the car. Got, you know, sun probably ate it up or something, but I was so devastated that, like, when I finally found someone who actually had it online, I bought it. I was like, not wasting time. Even when first time I bought it, the tape actually broke. When I tried to play, I'm like, fuck this. Sent it back. The guy was apologetic. Sent me a new one. No problems. But my number one is, and this is probably, if I was ranking all these in order, this would still be my number one, and that's Loz Rocket's Annihilation Principle, 1989. Dude, I can't crow enough about this. If there's one thrash record that just epitomizes thrash, it's this one. And you know, this band, kind of like Anthrax and a lot of, even like Overkill, but they started out a little more in the heavy metal, power metal vibe on earlier records like City of the Burn and stuff like that. But when I picked up Know Your Enemy and this Annihilation Principle as cassettes in the store in the late 80s, because I just remember seeing both the covers and thinking, wow, that's really fucking cool. It's almost like Contra, So I bought them, and I like Know Your Enemy a lot too, but you can still hear some of that heavy metal part of that band and Know Your Enemy, as opposed to the thrashier stuff that you hear on Annihilation and Sacred. They also, if you guys are horror fans and have seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, which is a great soundtrack, I'd add to that. The lead track on that record is a track called Leatherface by Loz Rocket. And I play that a lot too, especially on my shows. People have heard it all the time. The band has gone through rotation issues over the years, and they actually, after Nothing Sacred, which was 1990, I think, or 91, they disbanded, I guess. And, many reasons, who knows. But 2008, they released Left for Dead, which is a solid record for a comeback record. So I will recommend that as well if you're into that band at all. And it's still very much thrash. They kind of stuck with that sound without going back to some of the other stuff they were doing. Unfortunately, I wish they had put out more records since that. I thought that would kind of be a resurgence for them. I know that these guys are family guys too. Over the years they've got families, and they kind of left that world behind a little bit. But obviously, with the Doc and the 2008 album, they were still very much caring about the metal scene and what they had done and accomplished. And unfortunately, in 2018, Willie Lang, the bassist, passed away, and I think the drummer passed away pretty recently too. So I don't know if they're going to do anything more. I think their status is unknown at this point in terms of record or recordings. I would like to see at least one more release from them, just to see what they can do. But I will never not ever recommend this for any thrash fan or top list ever. Like, it just doesn't get mentioned a whole lot to me, which is unfortunate. And this is sort of kind of the same thing I got from the Doc. It's like, the guys in the Doc, certainly, like the other musicians in other bands, they certainly talk really good about Loz Rocket. Like, they played shows with them back then, so they're really positive about the band itself. But when it comes to other, what do I want to say, other reports or articles or lists, they never really give Loz the credit they really truly deserve. Like, Loz deserves, when it comes to the thrash movement, in terms of quality thrash records, Annihilation Principle deserves to be on that list anywhere. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It needs to be there. And it's probably my most highly recommended thrash record for anybody who wants to get into thrash metal. And with that, I appreciate you all taking the time to watch this. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I know I'm kind of corny sometimes, but fear not. I try my best, and keep listening to our channel. We have a website coming soon. I can't wait to debut that for you all then. But maybe I'll do like a top 25 death at some point, but I just wanted to get this out there because I know that I was on Gecko and I were on Retro Serial recently, and thought this would be a little bit helpful in terms of giving people ideas on what to check out if they are still new to thrash metal. So thanks again, all. Take care of yourselves. Peace out.